Welcome to Dialogue. So we spent a lot of time in our previous dives looking at how scientific information gets made. The whole process, peer review, institutional hurdles, even how data can get a bit twisted inside the lab or, say, boardroom.
Right.
But there's this final step. And, you could argue it's the most important one. It happens completely outside of those controlled spaces.
It's the moment it hits the public.
Exactly. The moment that raw information just lands in the public mind.
And that's the real inflection point, isn't it? That's where science stops being this pure search for truth.
And it becomes something else.
It becomes a vehicle for something way more powerful. We're talking about meaning-making, identity, and at the end of the day, social and political power.
So it transforms.
Completely. When that complex data gets filtered through people's existing biases, their fears, their loyalties, it changes. It goes from being a statistic to a personal belief. And from there, collective action is not far behind.
So this isn't just about simple mistakes or people accidentally getting it wrong, though that obviously happens all the time.
No, it's deeper than that.
What we really need to dig into today are the subtle but incredibly powerful forces, both psychological and communicative, that actually guide how people interpret all this complex, often conflicting information.
Especially in the environment we're in now, which is just total information overload.
Right. And it's not always some grand conspiracy, is it? It's more a predictable outcome of our own psychology, clashing with this chaotic information flow.
But that's the mission for this deep dive, really, to just pull back the curtain on those subtle mechanisms.
Okay.
We need to look at the specific lenses the public uses to absorb science. The psychological drivers that can turn a simple finding into an unshakable belief.
Even when it comes at the cost of
Yeah.
nuance or accuracy.
Often at the direct expense of it.
So we've got a few of these forces lined up to examine. Each one seems to act like a filter or maybe an accelerator for these narratives. We're going to get into the role of, fear for one.
Oh, fear is a huge one.
And the need for simplicity.
Yeah.
Then there's how identity can just dictate whether you accept something or not.
And the emotional framing around it all.
Critically, yeah. And then the big one that ties it all together.
Yeah.
The algorithmic structures that just keep reinforcing it all.
Right. These are the things that decide whether a piece of science is just seen as a neutral fact or if it becomes this thing that's debated or feared or even...
Becomes the core of someone's identity.
Exactly. That's the most interesting part.
All right, let's start at that foundation then. The public's role in all this distortion. Because it feels too easy to just blame the institutions or the media for sensationalizing things.
It is. The public isn't just a passive bucket that information gets poured into.
Right. They're actively processing it, filtering it through what they already believe.
And that moment, that adoption or rejection, that is the final stage. That's where persuasion becomes real collective power.
This is where that search for truth just gets completely hijacked then.
Irrevocably hijacked. It gets hijacked by our psychological need for meaning, for belonging. Our brains are, fundamentally story-making machines. We look for patterns.
Always.
And when science enters that system, the statistical rigor often gets stripped away in favor of, emotional resonance, a good story.
And that vulnerability is just massive. It's immediately exploited, right, by anyone trying to communicate. Science, politicians, media, special interests.
Absolutely. And there's no tool more effective for targeting that vulnerability than pure emotion.
Specifically fear.
Fear, without a doubt, is the most potent and fastest acting motivator we have. It's just baked into our psychology.
So when you frame something around danger or a threat,
information gets processed in a totally different way. Research on this is pretty clear. It effectively bypasses the prefrontal cortex.
The rational part of the brain.
The part responsible for analysis, for weighing trade-offs,
Right.
for critical thinking.
So it's like it just skips the internal quality control check entirely.
Precisely. It routes processing straight to the more primal limbic system. And that triggers reactive decision-making, not reflective analysis.
So we immediately stop asking, is this information any good?
Yeah, and we start asking, how do I survive this threat?
That's a critical distinction. If you appeal to my logic, maybe I challenge your method or your source.
Wait.
But if you appeal to my fear, I just act.
You just act. And think about something like the availability heuristic here. Fear works because it relies on stuff that's easy to recall, emotionally charged images.
A flood, a sick person, a chart with a big red arrow pointing out.
Exactly. Those vivid emotional examples are just so much more accessible in our memory than, say, a p-value or a confidence interval.
Which completely skews your sense of risk. It makes the really extreme, maybe low probability threat feel like it's right here, right now.
And the people communicating this stuff, the special interests, the media, they are hyper aware of this shortcut. They use fear not to help you understand a risk better, but to drive
You get
compliance.
clicks.
To get clicks, to get political support, to get you to buy something. Science, in that context, just becomes a tool for alarm. It demands you immediately get on board with whatever simple solution they're proposing.
And the whole incentive structure just backs that up. Alarm creates urgency,
Urgency creates engagement.
and engagement creates loyalty or money.
And suddenly, the original nuanced scientific finding is totally secondary. All that matters is its emotional power. So a finding that's maybe only a little bit threatening can get blown up into this catastrophic thing just because catastrophic is what survives and spreads in this ecosystem.
Which brings us right to the next big psychological piece. This deep need for clarity, for simplicity, for a good story. Because science is almost never simple. It's all about probabilities, complex systems, error bars.
But simple stories spread like wildfire.
And that creates this huge structural problem, doesn't it? A scientist can spend, what, a decade figuring out that factor A influences outcome B, but only like 60% of the time, and only if variables X, Y, and Z are also present.
And only in certain demographics.
Right. But the public message has to take that entire decade of work and boil it down to a soundbite.
A causes B. Do this. Don't do that.
We're just stripping away all the scientific caveats, all the uncertainty, because we want clear rules, we need heroes and villains, we need obvious causes and effects.
And this is where you see the trade-off between what we'd call statistical power and narrative clarity. Those caveats, the p-values, the confidence intervals, those are the signs of rigor.
But they create what you called cognitive friction. They make you stop and think.
And friction is death in the modern attention economy.
Yeah, you can't have that.
So those crucial markers of scientific honesty, they get stripped away because they get in the way of a good, simple story. And while those simple versions are great for mass communication, they inherently distort the reality they're supposed to represent.
They're sacrificing accuracy for something that's easy to remember and share.
Exactly.
And for the listener here, maybe you're trying to figure out a career move or a health decision for your family. Those simple stories are just so tempting.
Of course. They offer certainty. They reduce the mental load in a world that feels just overwhelmingly uncertain.
It's way easier to accept the super certain version from an influencer than it is to spend your evening trying to read the methodology section of an actual research paper.
And look, this distortion isn't always malicious. Sometimes it's just the natural result of information moving from a dense academic journal through an overworked editor and into a regardless of intent. The public ends up consuming a version of science that's been heavily processed for narrative convenience and emotional punch.
So once those two big psychological vulnerabilities are there, our preference for emotion, especially fear, and our demand for simplicity, you can see how entire infrastructures get built to exploit them.
That's right.
And I think the first big tactic we see is this manufacturing of conflict, creating these false dichotomies.
This is so central to understanding any modern public debate. Science, like we've said, almost always exists on a spectrum of uncertainty.
The data overlaps. Different methods give you slightly different answers.
Consensus is a process. It's not an event. The reality is messy. It's nuanced. It evolves.
But that is not how public debate works at all. Instead, everything is presented as this binary choice.
It's right versus wrong, safe versus dangerous.
Or the classic, experts versus skeptics.
And that binary framing is a manufactured drama. It's designed to force you to act. If you're presented with two choices that seem totally mutually exclusive, you're forced to pick a side.
And what it does, crucially, is it discourages you from ever looking at the big, complex gray area in the middle.
Which is where the scientific truth almost always is.
And you can't deny how effective that is for driving engagement, even if it's terrible for public understanding. Conflict just grabs your attention.
Oh, absolutely. If a scientist says, well, the data suggests a 40 to 60% chance of outcome X, but we still need to control for these other three variables, nobody cares.
Snooze. But if the headline is, experts clash, is X a miracle cure or a deadly poison?
That drives massive traffic, massive debate.
And the consequence of that is this deep social fracturing. It short-circuits any real engagement with the complexity. It just polarizes everyone.
And it forces you to align yourself ideologically with a side instead of intellectually with the evidence. And once you've picked a side, the issue stops being scientific. It instantly becomes tribal. It's about protecting your identity.
And that tribal alignment gets hammered home by emotional framing. We talked about fear, but it's much broader than that.
It's the whole package.
Yeah, the tone. Is it hopeful? Is it moralizing, frightening, accusatory? That framing dictates the immediate gut-level response from the public.
Let's just take a totally neutral scientific finding. Let's say research on a new public policy or a new technology.
Okay.
If that finding is framed with language that appeals to our moral foundations, things like protecting the vulnerable or ensuring fairness, you tap into a sense of moral responsibility, empathy.
But you could take that exact same finding, and if you frame it with concepts like government overreach or protecting individual liberty,
You evoke anger, resentment, calls for resistance.
and the science itself, the data, it hasn't changed at all.
It's static, but the emotional and moral frame transforms it from a neutral fact into this huge cultural battleground, and that is the crucial shift. The conversation moves completely away from the evidence itself.
Away from the methodology, the stats, the sample size.
And it becomes about pre-existing values, identity, and group loyalty. The science is just ammunition in a culture war.
And that's a much better narrative strategy because those emotional, moral arguments are just so much stickier. They're more shareable than some dry statistical argument.
You remember how a piece of information made you feel angry, hopeful, scared, long after you've forgotten the specific numbers that were attached to it?
And we're looking at framing. We have to talk about the strategic use of context.
Yeah.
Or maybe more to the point, the strategic removal of context.
Weaponizing a mission, yes. The principle is so simple, but it gets overlooked all the time. Facts without context can be incredibly misleading.
Context is what gives information its real meaning.
It's what defines reliability. It tells you how far you can generalize from the findings.
Right. It's the difference between a report and a piece of propaganda.
Exactly. So, for example, knowing that a study was done on a tiny sample of college students in one specific city, that's crucial context.
Because then you know the results are limited. It might be weak evidence for the general population.
But if you omit that crucial context, the raw finding, product X reduces symptom Y by 30%, suddenly sounds universal and super reliable.
And by strategically leaving out those limitations, communicators can make weak evidence seem incredibly strong.
We see this with selection bias all the time. You only present the outcomes from the one subgroup that looks good, and you just ignore the data from the majority that looks bad.
The claim is still technically true for that one little group.
But it's totally misleading overall. And you can use the same tactic in reverse to create doubt. You can take really strong consensus evidence and make it look shaky. You just focus on the one single methodologically flawed study that disagrees, the 2% of the literature, and you strategically omit the other 98% that forms the consensus.
And you create this illusion of a raging debate.
You succeed in shaping the perception of reliability in the mind of the consumer. It's narrative control 101. It's about curating the landscape to engineer a specific conclusion about how trustworthy the information is.
So we've got the psychological triggers, the narrative tactics that weaponize them. Now we have to look at how we interact with authority, with experts, and how even the tools designed to help us can backfire and damage trust. Let's start with what has to be the ultimate oversimplification, like that phrase, science says.
Oh, that phrase. Or its cousins, the facts are clear, the consensus is settled.
It's everywhere, and it's used like this stamp of absolute unquestionable authority. It's meant to shut down the conversation.
Case closed. Science is spoken.
But the reality, as we keep saying, is just so much more complicated.
Yeah.
Anyone who's actually worked in science knows it almost never speaks with one single voice.
Not at all. Studies conflict. Methodologies are different. Interpretations evolve. Science is a process of refining and self-correcting. It's not some final pronouncement from on high.
So that science says approach, it creates what you could call a certainty premium. It sells certainty to a public that is desperate for it.
Right. It elevates a snapshot of our current understanding to the level of ultimate, unchallengeable truth.
And then, the moment that certainty gets challenged by new data, the moment science does what it's supposed to do and corrects itself, the public doesn't see that as progress.
No, they see it as a betrayal, a contradiction, an outright lie.
They think, well, first they said X was safe, now they say it's dangerous, so either they were lying to us before or they have no idea what they're talking about.
And that certainty premium just instantly backfires. The trust you gain by oversimplifying is just violently lost. And it undermines confidence not just in that one finding, but in the entire scientific process.
And this erosion of trust gets amplified by this modern thing, the celebrity scientist.
Yeah.
In a culture that's driven by personality, where platforms reward engagement, not expertise, science isn't immune. Certain scientists become public figures, influencers.
They become the face of an entire field, even if their own expertise is actually quite narrow or their findings haven't been fully accepted yet. The media loves it, of course. It gives them a simple, charismatic spokesperson for a really complex issue.
But the risk there is just enormous. Public opinion starts to be guided not by the careful collective consensus of hundreds of researchers, but by the charisma or the media savvy of one or two people.
And this shifts the focus away from that collective, messy, slow process of science.
And it puts all this dangerous emphasis on individuals. And if that individual turns out to be wrong or misuses their platform,
The public's confidence in that entire field of study can be destroyed. It turns a rigorous discipline into a popularity contest.
speaking of conflict, we have to talk about the ultimate battleground for information, fact-checking. The original idea was great, obviously. Clarify the truth, provide a quick, neutral verification system. But its role has gotten so twisted in public.
The evidence suggests it's gone from being an objective referee to being seen as a player on the field.
It's seen as a tool to validate one narrative while flagging or deplatforming another.
And the second that fact-checkers are perceived as partisan, when their funding, their staff, their affiliations seem to line up with one side, the whole process just loses its legitimacy for anyone on the other side.
They don't see verification anymore. They see censorship, a targeted attack.
And the crisis of perception here is one of the most serious problems we have. Instead of clearing things up, fact-checking just becomes another layer of the ideological fight.
The question stops being, is this statement factually true?
And it immediately becomes, whose side is the fact-checker on and what's their agenda? It weaponizes the very process of verification.
And the damage is huge because it erodes trust not just in the science being debated, but in the very systems that are supposed to verify any information.
If you can't trust the verifiers, then every truth just becomes a matter of which tribe you belong to.
And all of this erosion of trust, this fracturing of what's real, it's not happening in a vacuum. It's being constantly, systematically reinforced.
Right, by the very architecture of the platforms we use.
Let's bring in that mechanism we talked about at the start, algorithmic reinforcement.
This is the invisible hand that makes all the other stuff so powerful. Algorithms aren't neutral. They are not optimizing for truth.
They're optimizing for metrics, clicks, shares, how long you watch something, emotional reaction.
And what gets the biggest emotional reaction, as we've established? Conflict, fear, and simple certainties.
So the algorithm is essentially a reward system for distortion.
It is. If you post a really nuanced, careful scientific finding, it gets low engagement and just disappears. But if you take that same finding, simplify it into a binary fight, and frame it with a ton of emotional urgency, this cure is being covered up by the establishment. The algorithm sees that massive engagement
And pushes it to millions of people.
and this creates this incredibly powerful, self-reinforcing feedback loop. Our own psychological preference for simple, emotional, fear-based stories gets fed into the algorithm.
The algorithm learns what we want.
It learns that preference and it prioritizes content with those features, so it shows you more content that is simple, emotional, and fear-based.
So it's optimizing for polarization and emotional reactivity, because that's what drives engagement time, which is the only thing the platform really cares about.
And this is how you build sophisticated echo chambers and filter bubbles. If you signal through your clicks and shares that you prefer narratives that are, say, anti-establishment,
The algorithm just feeds you a continuous diet of content that confirms that identity.
regardless of how scientifically rigorous any of it is, you are very rarely shown the complex, nuanced reality that might contradict what you want to believe.
So identity-driven misinformation isn't just surviving online. It's being financially subsidized and technologically optimized to spread as far as possible.
Which makes the job of an honest communicator, someone trying to explain uncertainty and nuance, almost impossible. Their content will always be throttled in favor of the high-octane emotional stuff.
Okay, so we've broken down the whole machine. The psychological triggers, the narrative tactics, the failures of authority, the tech reinforcement. Let's put it all together and look at the real-world consequences of this. If you had to summarize the system's flaws, What's the one overwhelming force driving all this?
I think the conclusion has to be that public misunderstanding of science is not an accident. It's not a failure of public intelligence.
That's a predictable outcome.
It's a predictable, systematic outcome of a reward structure. The entire modern system, social media, legacy media, political incentives, it all rewards speed over depth, emotion over nuance, and absolute certainty over the honest admission of uncertainty.
It's a tragedy of incentives
Yeah.
played out on a global scale.
It is. The very things that make science good, its slowness, its self-correction, its skepticism, its complexity, are the exact same things that make it unpopular and unrewarded in the public sphere.
And because our brains are wired for stories and for belonging, not for processing stats.
The version of science that survives that public gauntlet is always the simplified, emotionally charged, identity-affirming version. Every headline, every viral post just adds another layer of distortion.
So we have to admit that in the public arena, science isn't really operating as a neutral search for truth.
No, it's operating as a vehicle for emotional release, for identity confirmation, for making sense of the world, and that shapes policy, it shapes markets, it shapes our culture.
The real-world stakes are just enormous. When fear or tribalism or this radical oversimplification drives how the public interprets critical data on a pandemic, a new technology, environmental rules,
Those personal decisions collectively reshape the trajectory of entire societies. We end up with policies based on alarmist headlines, which often fail because they don't account for the long-term complexity.
right? An oversimplified narrative that demands dramatic, immediate action based on fear could lead to us adopting a technology too early before we really understand the side effects.
The certainty that was sold in the narrative just overrides the caution that's necessary in the scientific process.
And the ultimate result is a society that's increasingly running on these self-reinforcing, emotionally satisfying stories.
Rather than on the complex, uncertain, and slow process of gathering evidence. And those narratives, while they feel really comforting in their simplicity, are often built on intellectual foundations that are shaky or just dangerously incomplete.
Which brings us, I think, to the final, really critical question that all of this forces us to confront. If the systems of public perception are so optimized for distortion, if our brains are wired for stories and our platforms reward emotional chaos, how stable is the actual truth underneath all that narrative?
And to add to that, if the information environment is specifically designed to generate engagement through conflict and fear, what responsibility do people who have the tools for critical thought, like you, the listener, have in protecting the integrity of that truth?
It's not enough anymore to just know the facts.
Not at all. We have to understand the complex filters that those facts pass through to reach us, how they're perceived, distorted, and weaponized.
So we have to move beyond just consuming information to analyzing the motivation behind it. The essential skill now is not just asking, is this true, but immediately following that with.
What am I being emotionally rewarded for believing this? And what crucial context is missing from this story that would introduce some necessary, inconvenient uncertainty?
That ability to evaluate the source, the framing, and the system that's pushing it to you. That seems like the essential work of just navigating the world today. If you enjoyed this conversation, please like, subscribe, and share this video. Also, let us know in the comments what really stood out to you in this conversation, and if there's any related topic or new topic that you would like covered in a future video.